Here we are, another edition, another episode 5, that is, of That 70s Pod. As always, this is Andrew Lockhart, and my guest of honor today, Brian. How are you?
I'm fine. Again, you don't have to call me the guest of honor. You and I are working together to make this work.
So, co host? I guess I don't really know what to call you.
Okay, well, co-host would be fine. You're actually the host. I guess I'm the '70s authority.
Okay. And speaking of 70s, we might go a little off topic of how we usually do things, but I'm going to ask you some first, like, rapid fire questions, and then we will go from there. So, pro wrestling. You're a pro wrestling fan. I'm a pro wrestling fan. When you think of pro wrestling from the 70s, promotion, territory, area, what pops in your mind right away?
Well, growing up as a kid in the Midwest in St. Paul, Minnesota, the pro wrestling that we were exposed to at that time was called the American Wrestling Association, which is the AWA, which was run by Vern Gagne. And I first started watching pro wrestling. My brother got me turned on to it in the very early '70s, 71 or 72. And I mean, I was little, I was 9 or 10 years old. And it wasn't until maybe I was 11 or 12 that my brother and I actually started wrestling each other after watching pro wrestling on TV. And Andrew, I know you can relate to that.
Yeah, so AWA started in in the 60s. So you said he and your brother introduced you to AWA wrestling. Was it a magazine, a picture, a story from someone at school, TV? Like, what's your first memory of, like, what you mean wrestling? What's this?
Well, it was my brother and I. We were living in St. Paul with our parents, and we had an upstairs bedroom, and we had like a 15-inch, 17-inch black and white color. You can't have black and white and color. Black and white TV, and and at that time you could pick up four channels in the Twin Cities, and CBS, NBC, ABC, of course, and then whatever the independent station was, which at the time was WTCN, which was on Channel 11. And every Saturday night, Andrew, at 6 o'clock, pro wrestling was on for an hour and a half. And at that time, Andrew, it was live. So if they had a show at the Minneapolis Auditorium that started around 10 o'clock at night, or maybe 9:30, they could promote what was going to happen at the auditorium on this live TV show, which was on from 6 to 7:30. So when you would hear that old phrase, "Run, don't walk" to the box office, they meant it. They meant it because you literally had an hour and a half to get down to the Minneapolis Auditorium to watch the events that they were staging. The house show is maybe what the term most people would be familiar with. After watching uh, events leading up to that show on live TV.
So, quick side question. WTCN turned into Care 11. Do you remember if it was also Channel 11 growing up?
It was on Channel 11. And at that time, Channel 11 was the independent station. And a change was made in the early '80s, Andrew, where the NBC affiliate um, jumped to Channel 11 and the independent station, the independent affiliate became Channel 9. So, but that didn't happen until the very early '80s, or maybe it was late '70s when that happened.
So when you were watching it, was it actually an arena full of people, or was it the filming where it's just like studio television? You just have two sides on either ring, and then
Right.
just one camera. So that's what you were seeing.
That's what you were seeing. You basically see people on two sides of the ring, and the filming was done um, somewhere near Lake Phalen in Minneapolis. It was at the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club. I don't know where that was exactly. I never went to any of the tapings. And again, at that time, it was a live show anyway. But it was just a lot of fun watching it as a kid. And in my first exposure, the first wrestler I remember seeing was somebody called Dirty Dusty Rhodes. Now, if you remember, Dusty Rhodes later became the American Dream and was one of the most famous wrestlers of all time. But back in the early '70s, when I first started watching wrestling, Dusty Rhodes was a rule breaker and really good at it. He had lots of feuds with Wahoo McDaniel, which was the classic cowboy versus Indian type.
So what was it about Dirty Dusty Roads that like you you remember? Like what do you visually it was in black and white as you said, but
Yeah.
was something specific about him? Like, oh my gosh, look at how big that guy is, or his hair, or was it just his personality right away?
Well, it was his personality and everything was. Um, he would end all his sentences by saying "Daddy." Like I'm. I'm gonna beat that guy up, Daddy, and you come down and spend your money on me, Daddy. And he was just funny. He had great personality, and he was just funny. And when he was working in the ring, he would always make noises like dit, 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 and I don't know why he was making those noises, but he at that time, Andrew, he had really short blonde hair, not the long curly locks that you remember him seeing or remember when you used to watch him wrestle in the '90s. And so he was young at the time. I think he might have been heavier at the time, and I remember my mom walking into my room when I was watching this, and seeing this big guy with short blonde hair with this distorted look on his face, and she said, "He looks like a pig with a wig." So that was Dirty Dusty Rhodes, and that was my first exposure of pro wrestling was seeing him.
So, to go with Dusty Rhodes just a little bit for a second, eventually when you started watching more and more, did you ever watch you watched it with your brother? Did you ever watch it with your dad?
No, my dad did not like professional wrestling. According to him, this was a legend. I don't know if it was true or not, but he had an altercation once in a bar, and I don't know when this was, Andrew. I'm guessing it was late '50s during his honky tonk days, where he approached a pro wrestler in a bar, and and was lipping off to this pro wrestler, and I have no idea who it was. And the pro wrestler cold cocked him and knocked him down, knocked him out. And so my dad just had a thing about pro wrestlers after that and didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Interesting. So staying on topic of when you were in the 70s watching wrestling, one more Dusty Rhodes question. What was it? Oh, was there anything okay, when I first saw Dusty Rhodes, he actually did have short hair. The first time because we didn't watch him in NWA. He already cut his hair and then wearing the polka dots. That not to be rude, but that birthmark like really stood out to me, like on his stomach. Was that something you noticed as a kid? Oh, can we not
Yeah, and
cross?
you know what, Andrew? Yeah, that I remember that birthmark on his right side, right below his chest, sort of, upper part of the belly. But even on a black and white TV, Andrew, that just really showed up. And you would think on a black and white TV you wouldn't notice it as much, but man, that thing was huge. You just really noticed it even on a black and white TV. So yeah, that was something. And whenever you saw him wrestle, you couldn't help but look at that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's something I remember as a 9 year old.
So you're 9 years old. You're watching it. When did you start actually realizing what was going on with pro wrestling instead of just two guys in the ring fighting? Was it clear at AWA television at the time, like Vern Gagne's in charge, Wally Carbo's also in charge, unless that was like a Jack Tunney thing. I don't know if that was actually real that he was in charge. But when did it start seem like a show? Like you said before, Happy Days, Gilligan's Island. There's all these different characters, right? And you know their personalities. When did you start seeing AWA wrestling as a show with characters?
Well, I did not for
Yeah.
quite some time because in the '70s, Andrew, it was considered a sport. Um, it wasn't like what happened in the late '80s when Vince McMahon decided to call professional wrestling entertainment, and basically, just threw his own federation under the bus. Basically, you know, uh, Vern Gagne was so superb at protecting the business. He was huge on kayfabe, and you could probably explain kayfabe better than I could. It was important to Vern to keep the bad guys separated from the good guys. They were never seen traveling together. If they were on the same plane, one group would leave the plane, and the other group would wait maybe 15, 20 minutes before they left the plane, so it didn't look like they were all on the same plane. Vern was very good at protecting the business and making it seem like it was real, and I bought into that. I believed it was real. If Ivan Koloff split open Billy Robinson's head, and all of a sudden Billy Robinson couldn't wrestle that night at the Minneapolis Auditorium, I believed all that. So um, yeah, it took a while for me to I guess come to my senses. No, I don't want to say it like that, because I'm a fan of pro wrestling, and even though I know the secrets now, back then it's kind of like Santa Claus. I didn't want to know the secrets. I just enjoyed Santa Claus for who he was.
So when like it was big in Minnesota. So was it kind of looked as another sport in your mind? It's like you have the team of the Minnesota Vikings, you have the Timberwolves, you have the Twins, and then you have the wrestling team, and they're just titled AWA. Is that how you saw it? Like it was just like the sports league?
Well, absolutely, because if you remember, Andrew, in our podcast a few weeks ago, we were talking about boxing, and I told you at that time that boxing was a big thing in the '70s. They had Friday night fights every week, um, and it wasn't unusual to see Muhammad Ali defend his title on TV, or they didn't have pay-per-views back then, but you could pay money to go watch it on closed circuit TV at the Minneapolis Auditorium. So boxing was huge in the '70s, and I associated pro wrestling with that. Matter of fact, they had pro wrestlers occasionally go up against professional boxers. The famous Muhammad Ali versus Antonio Inoki in 1976, where Andre the Giant had a match with boxer Chuck Wepner and threw him out of the ring. All of that happened in the '70s. So boxing and wrestling were both big deals, and so I believed in all of
So I thought we were maybe going to go all over the place 70s wise, but you said you were 9 years old when you remember watching like Dusty Road. So was that so that would have been 62 or 72 or
Well, 71 or 72, and in '73 is when my brother and I kind of started wrestling each other because we had moved to a different house, and we had a furnished basement that had lots of room. There was a family room, and we could. I mean, it was cement. It was a cement floor, but it was carpeted, so there was a little bit of padding there. But my brother was a huge mark, which means fan, of superstar Billy Graham. Superstar Billy Graham came to the AWA around '72, '73, and at the time he he was the most jacked wrestler on the circuit. I mean, most of your wrestlers look like the Crusher. They were just thick, but they weren't muscular. And Superstar Graham, who years later we found out was using steroids and it wrecked his liver to the point where he needed a transplant. Um, but he was a great talker, and so my brother pictured himself as Superstar Graham's tag team partner, and so he would put on like these dark blue sweatpants that were kind of tight, so they looked like wrestling tights, and he had like this green T-shirt and sleeveless T-shirt, and put on some costume jewelry because that's what Superstar Graham did. I mean, you could look at any YouTube now and see how colorful that guy was. And my brother envisioned himself as Superstar Graham's partner. So I would always have to be the Kenny Jays or the George Kadaskis or whatever tag team was around the AWA. So my brother could pretend to be well, he called himself and his make believe superstar Billy Graham the Superstars or Team Superstars, something like that. So we would wrestle in the basement and we would just have a great time. He was 5 years older than me and a lot bigger and a lot stronger. My brother actually could have been a pro wrestler because he certainly had the build for it. But again, unfortunately, my dad would not have anything to do with pro wrestling. So my brother really didn't know how to get into it.
So, when you moved in, curiosity, when you moved into this new house, what city? Where was this?
It was still in St. Paul.
Okay, so do you remember? Okay, 1973, yes or no? Did you and your brother ever go to a live event?
No, again, that was something we wanted to do,
Mm,
but that was something that my parents were not going to spend money on.
gotcha. So I found this website, shout out to crazymax.org, that has every single big event or television tape in order of 1973. So from January 6th, 1973 in Minneapolis all the way to Christmas time, I believe. So is there a certain month or time frame or a match that was being built up that you remember in 1973?
Well, actually, in the latter half of '73 is when superstar Billy Graham was having a feud against the man who made Milwaukee famous, the Crusher. Um,
How did the
and
feud start?
well, the Crusher was having a match with superstar Graham. And I don't remember, Andrew, if it was on TV or if it was at the Minneapolis Auditorium, but a wrestler named Larry Hynemi interfered in the match and caused the Crusher to lose. And the Crusher was just furious. So he said that he wanted Superstar Graham and Larry Hynemi in a cage so they couldn't get away from him. And so he could give them the pounding that they deserve. Well, the promoter, um, who at that time I believe was Al DeRusha, he came out and said, Crusher, I can't let you get in a cage with these two by yourself. And Crusher was adamant about wrestling these guys by himself in a cage match. And he finally decided that, okay, I'll go find a partner if that's what it takes to get these two guys in the ring. Well, on the other side, Andrew, superstar Billy Graham and Larry Hynemi said, there's no way we're going to get in the cage with a Crusher. You can't pay us $10,000 a piece to get in the cage with a Crusher. Well, a different promoter, Wally Carbo, came out and said, you want $10,000 to get in the cage? You got it. So, they both looked at the camera speechless, didn't say anything, and walked off the screen, not believing what they had just heard. And of course, I'm just eating this up. I think all this is real. This is really happening. So the following week, Andrew, they both come out and they say they're $10,000 richer and they're going to get in the cage and they're going to protect themselves and make sure Crusher doesn't tear them apart. Meanwhile, everyone's waiting to hear who Crusher goes and gets as a partner. So the Crusher comes out and he tells announcer Marty O'Neill, I want you to think of the dirtiest, rotten wrestler that you can. And he said, Blackjack Lanza. Crusher said, no. And Marty O'Neill said, Dick the Bruiser. And Crusher said, I wanted to get Dick the Bruiser, but he wasn't available. And then Marty O'Neill said, the Sheik, the original Sheik. And Crusher said no. And then Marty O'Neill said, well, Crusher, there's one guy I have in the back of my head, but I wouldn't believe you would ever go out and get this guy because you guys just had the biggest feud ever in the 60s and you hated each other forever and ever. Is it Mad Dog Vachon? And Crusher said, it is. And Marty O'Neill says, how can you trust Mad Dog Vachon? And he said, I've talked to him and he's given me my word that we're going to go in there and lay a whooping on Billy Graham. Larry Hynemi, and he called Larry Hynemi Snake Hynemi, and he said afterwards we'll go back to not being friends anymore. Or we'll go back to being enemies. But Mad Dog Vachon has given me his word that he'll stick to business and we'll get the job done.
So right before he announced Mad Dog, were you sitting there like, did you have any guesses or anybody you wanted to see to be his partner?
Well, you could kind of tell what it was leading up to, and they even showed a picture of Mad Dog Vachon um, on the screen, on the TV screen, as they were announcing it. So it wasn't like it was a surprise. I mean, to me, a kid, at that time I was maybe 11, I didn't even pick up on the fact that, gee, how did they know it was going to be Mad Dog Vachon to the point where they could have a picture of him ready to show on the screen? That just blew right by me. So, but it was exciting. Certainly wanted to go. Knew that I couldn't. My brother wanted to go too, um, but I don't think he was driving yet. He would have been 16 at the time. So yeah, just great fun. And so we kind of did our own version of that, where my brother was pretending. Now, this is when he and I were wrestling on the basement floor, where he didn't want to do a match, and I had to pretend to be a promoter and hand him an envelope containing money, saying, "Here's the money you want. You have to get in the ring." And so we reenacted what we had just seen on TV, because it was cool. So we had to do our own version of that, and pretend to be pro wrestlers in our basement, and it was just a lot of fun, Andrew.
So there is with that cage match, the tag team cage match. Do you remember when it was? Because there was two of them. There was one booked in Green Bay, Wisconsin, April 7th, and that was 1974. But and then before that, it was Christmas time in Minneapolis. So I'm guessing that was the one, December 29th, 1973, Minneapolis. Is that the one you saw promoted?
Yeah, that would have been in Minneapolis. They did the majority of their shows at the Minneapolis Auditorium, which held about 5,000 to 6,000 people. There was also an auditorium in St. Paul, but they didn't use that one that much. The Minneapolis one was bigger, and this would have been years before the St. Paul Civic Center was constructed. Um, and Vern started using the St. Paul Civic Center more in the late 70s, early 80s, because that seated uh, 16, 17,000 people. And at that time, they were starting to draw a lot more. So, but up until then, they were still holding shows at the Minneapolis Auditorium.
Gotcha. So when you didn't see that match, but it seems like if you had to talk about your first AWA memory, it was that build of 1973. When did you find out the results? Or like what were you thinking? What were you hoping to see? Like so
Right.
what about the aftermath of this match?
They had the results the next week on TV, and I guess I never saw it. I wish I would have, but my brother said, or maybe he saw it on a news channel or something, because occasionally it didn't happen very often, but if there was something big going on in pro wrestling, one of the local news stations, sports stations, would probably Channel 4, CBS, would go down and do some videotaping um, of the matches down there, just for fun, I guess. Um, because people like to see that stuff, whether they believed it or not, or whether they thought it was a sport or not. But my brother saw it somewhere where um, I remember him saying that the referee in the match, whoever that was, um, didn't even do anything. He just folded his arms and leaned back against the turnbuckle in one of the corners, and just let all four of them go at it. Crusher and Mad Dog won the match, leaving the other two bloody. And at that time, to win a cage match, Andrew, you had to crawl up the side of the cage and swing your legs over the top, and then crawl down the other side of the cage, outside of the ring, and when your feet hits the floor, you're declared the winner. So back then, that's how you had to win a cage match. And Crusher and Mad Dog did win.
So I got the card right here. Do you remember any of the other matches being built for that card?
Oh gosh, no.
Okay. And like something
I mean, they put so much into promoting that cage match, and they didn't do cage matches very often. Um, maybe every 2 or 3 years they would have a cage match uh, in Minneapolis. But so this was a big deal.
Yeah, I was gonna say because reading this, of interesting enough, it says a fence match. Did you ever hear that? Or did they
I've never heard that term. I mean, they promoted it as a cage match.
okay.
Uh, but whatever periodical you're reading there, somebody might look at that as a fence being around the ring, and so they just called it a fence match. But it was a cage match. I mean, that was the purpose of it. When you put something or someone or an animal in a cage uh, to the point where they can't get out, it's a cage. It's not a fence; it's a cage.
So reading this, this was a Saturday, but what's interesting is that it says Saturday night, December 29th, Minneapolis Auditorium. But then it says December 29th, Minneapolis TV. And then it also says December 29th, Moline TV. So I'm guessing those are already pre-taped stuff that was just being aired that day anyway.
Well, how Vern used to do things, Andrew, is he would have all the wrestlers come in on Monday morning and tape their interviews for all the different areas that they used to wrestle in. I mean, they were in Chicago, they were in Winnipeg, they were in Denver, they were in San Francisco, and so they would do all their tapings on Monday morning and ship all those interviews out to those various stations, complete with matches, studio matches that had already been taped. They weren't live everywhere like they were in the Twin Cities at that time. So that's how they used to do it.
So, let's do this for fun. We're talking about 1973. You're talking about this is pretty much the biggest feud and biggest match that you remember, and it was sold out. It was 7,986 people at this event, and 4,000 were turned away from the door. So you
Yep.
weren't there, but you were watching AWA in 1973. So let me just read the card, and let's do a fun thing. Let's do name association. So I'm gonna read these people. You just tell me the first thing that pops in your mind that you remember as a kid. So
Sure.
starting with the main event, we'll say the same names. The Crusher.
Well, the Crusher was just he was kind of the enforcer of the AWA. Vern Gagne would let a bad guy kind of rule the roost for a while and beat up on everybody, and when it was finally time to put the bad guy in his place, he'd bring in the Crusher for a feud. And after Superstar Graham had run roughshod over various wrestlers, Wahoo McDaniel, Billy Robinson, whatever, the Crusher was finally brought in to lay down the law.
Mad Dog Vachon.
Well, I didn't see a lot of Mad Dog Vachon in the early '70s. He was more a late '60s, mid to late '60s wrestler for Vern, and then he left the territory, and then they brought him back for this cage match in '73, like we mentioned. So I didn't really see a lot of Mad Dog Vachon up until that point.
So you already explained how you viewed Billy Graham. His partner, I've never even heard this guy before, Larry Hynemi.
Larry Hynemi was actually trained by Vern Gagne in the '60s, and and he initially went under the handle of Luscious Lars Anderson, and I think one of the reasons that they gave him that name instead of letting him use his real name, which is Larry Hynemi, um, is because they already had another Larry at the time in Larry Pretty Boy Hennig, which of course later became the Axe and is the father of Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig.
Well, didn't AWA have Lars and like Ole Anderson at the time?
Different family. They
No, but
um,
then
Ole and Arn Anderson never wrestled in the AWA. Um, there was a Gene Anderson, which it was around briefly, but I really don't know the story. I mean, that was before I started watching.
okay, back to the card. The next match was Buddy Wolf defeated Ken Patera.
Buddy Wolf later became a tag team partner of Larry Heinebe.
Mhm.
Um, Buddy Wolf, actually, interesting story about him is when they were trying to, or when they were promoting the Muhammad Ali match um, with Antonio Inoki, Muhammad Ali turned up in Chicago and wrestled a couple exhibition matches. One was against Kenny J, who you're familiar with, and the other was against beautiful Buddy Wolf. And Buddy Wolf actually picked up Muhammad Ali and gave him a backbreaker, if you can believe that. And and they called the match a draw, but Buddy Wolf actually beat Muhammad Ali on live TV. It was on ABC Sports on a Saturday, so that was actually kind of cool. And he wasn't the greatest wrestler. He was just kind of thick and big, and he actually was wound up inventing the flags that you see at the end zone of football games. That I can tell you more about that story another time, but um, the flags that you see in the end zone at a football game is something that beautiful Buddy Wolf invented.
Like on the
So
bronze?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a long story. It's interesting, but it doesn't really fit into this format right now, or the story we're talking about. His opponent Ken Patera was also trained by Vern Gagne in the early '70s, along with Jim Brunzell, Greg Gagne, the Iron Sheik, and Ric Flair. Ken Patera went out to have a pretty decent career as a wrestler. He's retired now, lives in Minnesota, and he was a weightlifter in the Olympics. Very strong man. He at the time he didn't have a physique like superstar Graham did. He developed that later, but he was just a big strong guy with a big gut at the time when he wrestled in the AWA.
So you as a kid seeing these people, that's kind of what I was asking. What do you remember seeing these people like? Because the next match is Vivian Vachon defeats Princess Jasmine. Do you remember either of those two?
Well, Vivian Vachon was a real live niece of Mad Dog Vachon,
Okay.
and so I imagine she was on the card because Mad Dog was on the card. Um, so uh, there's always been Vachons in the pro wrestling circuit. Mad Dog had a brother named Butcher, and of course, much later, Luna Vachon
Hmm.
came from that family as well. So um, Vivian, I never saw Vivian Vachon wrestle, but rumor has it she wrestled just like her uncle. she she just kind of tore people apart.
Do you remember Princess Jasmine or what she
I
looked
have
like?
no idea. Yeah, I have no idea who that is.
Okay, so 9-year-old Brian. What about these next guys? Greg Gagne came to a draw with Rene Goulet.
Um, Greg Gagne, of course, like I mentioned, he was a rookie in '72, and that might have been his first match, Andrew, because whenever Vern Gagne put his rookies into the ring, Rene Goulet, who was a journeyman wrestler, not a bad wrestler, he would always kind of get the call to give these guys their first match. And Greg was real skinny at the time, even more skinny than what you remember him when your interaction with him later on. Um, but but at the time it was just probably one of those things where Greg needed to get his first match, went to a 20-minute draw with Rene Goulet. That's not surprising at all.
So you sound like because he was a rookie, that was his first match. You really don't have much memory right away of Greg Gagne, and that's probably the same with this next match. Again, I believe it's a rookie match. We have Ric Flair defeating Bull Boninsky.
Bull Belinsky.
Bolinsky,
Um,
right?
Bull Belinsky was a fun guy to watch. He was a truck driver.
What do you look
Uh,
like?
well, he was short, and he had this big old beer guts, and he used to wrestle in blue jeans, and he'd come out and go Bolinsky, and he used to basically win his matches by jumping off the second rope, um, butt first on his opponent, so a splash. Um, and at that time, that's the first time I'd ever seen anybody do that. So I just thought that was the smartest thing in the world for a big guy to do that. Ric Flair, like we said, was a rookie at that time, and certainly not the Ric Flair that we saw later in life. With the long blonde hair and the sculpted body. I mean, Ric Flair was chubby, and he was a big kid and had short brown hair that was parted on the side, and didn't look anything like the Ric Flair that we uh, learned to know and love much later in the 80s and 90s.
So to open the match, the last one I'm gonna read and see what 9-year-old Brian remembers of these two when he visually saw them. You have Kenny J defeated Tom DeMarco.
And I don't know anything about Tom DeMarco, and whenever Kenny J got to wrestle at the Minneapolis Auditorium, it usually meant that they were short on on other wrestlers. Now you notice on that card, of course, you got the Crusher and Superstar Graham and Mad Dog Vachon. That's the main event. None of those other matches really meant a hill of beans to anybody. For whatever reason, Nick Bockwinkel wasn't on that card, Andrew. Ray Stevens wasn't on that card. Billy Robinson wasn't on the card. Vern himself didn't wrestle. So you kind of wonder what was going on that nobody else was on this card.
Chris,
It was just a bunch of nobody matches. With guys that went on to do greater things later. But when Ken Patera and Buddy Wolf is your semi-main event, that's not really saying a whole lot.
I wonder if it's just like Christmas time. And I don't
Could
know.
be.
Yeah, it could be. But I like this forum because it sounds like AWA is a big thing in your life, and this is just 1973. And let's do a little bit more professional wrestling AWA in the future. So that wraps it up for today. Um, SoundCloud having issues with that, so we're only on YouTube as of right now. But this is 1973 AWA. We got a few seconds left. Any last words, Brian?
No, it's always fun talking about pro wrestling because it's something that I grew up with, wrestling with my brother in the basement. Uh, Matter of fact, my brother is 65 now. I'm 60, and whenever we get together, we still talk about pro wrestling. So we had fun back then, and it was just some great memories, and it's always fun to talk about it. So thanks for tuning in. Have a great week. Peace, my friends.
Peace. Hey everybody, this is Andrew Lockhart here, and I know I talked about last week of Drew's adventure of GodTheFather Apparel.com. God the Father seeks to provide high quality Christian streetwear apparel for believers and followers of Christ. I wanted Christian clothing to spark a conversation, so I made these shirts. That's Drew's words, and these are my words. This is Andrew Lockhart here once again to tell you go to GodTheFatherApparel.com/Andrew dash Lockhart. Once again, that's godthefatherapparel.com/Andrew dash Lockhart. I'm telling you, go there now. You can use the code Lockhart, LOCKHART 15, Lockhart 15 at discount to get 15% off. But I want to tell you right now, you should go and use the code BUNDLE. That's BUNDLE. Use bundle at checkout because if you buy a hoodie and type in the word bundle, you get a t-shirt for free. And that code can be stacked on. So if you're looking for some Christian gifts, you can claim 2 free t-shirts if you buy 2 hoodies and so on and so on. So that's godthefatherapparel.com/Andrew-Lockhart. And remember, right now I'm going to tell you to use the code bundle instead. BUNDLE. BUNDLE. Excuse me. Just remember to use the code bundle and see the price drop. That's godthefatherapparel.com/Andrew-Lockhart.